I'm Mike Peterson, philosophy at Asbury University, and it's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Kevin Seybold. About 15 years ago, I was writer-in-residence for a year at Greenville College, and it was learned while I was there that I have an interest in religion and science. And the name was recommended to me then that if I could ever connect with Kevin Seybold, that it would be a productive thing. And in the last few years, Kevin and I have connected, and I'm delighted, and I'm very delighted he could be here and share with us today. He is professor of psychology at Grove City College in Pennsylvania, where he teaches courses in physiological psychology. And as I said, he's a Greenville grad. That's why Greenville was very conscious of his stature and his accomplishments. He's a Greenville College grad with a PhD from the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee. He's published articles in a number of major journals, such as Physiology and Behavior, the International Journal of Neuroscience, and the Journal of Psychology and Christianity. His books include Explorations in Neuroscience, Psychology, and Religion. That's a 2007 publication from Ashgate. And a new one that is forthcoming is Spirituality and Healthcare, forthcoming from Oxford University Press. He spent 3 summers very recently as a research fellow in science and Christianity at Oxford University. His talk today is God and the Brain, Navigating the Research on Religious Experience and Spirituality. Help me welcome Dr. Seybold.
For over 40 years, my father was a pastor in the Free Methodist denomination, and while he did not attend Asbury Seminary, many of his colleagues and friends did up in Wabash Conference in Indiana. So I've heard about Asbury all of my life, and it's a real privilege for me to be here on campus, to see the place, and to meet some of the people who work here. And so my thanks to Mike and Mike as well for the invitation. Honored to be here. What I want to do in the next hour is to really do 3 things. First, give a brief and very brief review of how psychology has approached religion in the past and how it approaches religion today. And then second, to look at some of the researchers who have been spending, really in the last 20 years or so, their time looking at the brain's involvement in religious experience, and give you a flavor for what they've been doing. And then finally, to look at this question and again bring in some of the research from cognitive science and psychology, looking at whether or not spirituality is an innate characteristic of human beings. So one of my goals here is to consider how psychology, scientific psychology, not clinical psychology, I'm not a clinician or counselor, I'm an experimental psychologist, so how scientific psychology is being used to study and better understand religion and spirituality, to suggest that psychology and science in general can study religion without resorting to reductionism. And that's an important point that I want to make. Hopefully at the end that will be clear, that what is being done in psychology and neuroscience can, in the hands of some, be reductionistic in its understanding of what religion is. But it need not be so. And I certainly do not take that reductionistic position. And then finally, to suggest that psychology and psychological science can aid in our understanding of religion. Psychology was founded in the late 19th century, and it intentionally was developed and patterned itself after the sciences of that period, namely physiology and physics. And so the founders of psychology, like Wilhelm Wundt, G. Stanley Hall, and others, wanted to make a psychology that was scientific in its approach to the study of human behavior and human mind. And while some might argue, and I've heard this from some of my students, that psychology was founded by a bunch of atheists, that in fact is not actually the case. In fact, many of the early founders of psychology, like G. Stanley Hall that I mentioned a moment ago, and James Angell, actually argued in some of their lay writings that psychology, this new psychology, could be successfully used to help understand the religious experience. And here we have, as an example of that, William James, who in his book in 1902, The Variety of Religious Experiences, said that religion for James is, quote, at least as interesting as any other of the facts pertaining to his, mankind's, mental constitution. So religion should be part of what psychology studies. And James was not alone in that position here in the early part of the 20th century. Well, in the later decades of the 20th century, that approach to psychology, or to religion by psychology, really underwent a change. In the middle part of the 20th century, largely under the influence of this individual, who was not a psychologist, I want to hasten to add. He was a neurologist, but nevertheless, his thoughts on religion had a great deal of impact on how psychology in the middle part of the 20th century went about thinking about religion and studying religion. Essentially, Freud's view was that religion is based on wish fulfillment. We wish there was a heavenly Father who took care of us. We wish there was a life after death for which the good were rewarded and the bad punished. But in fact, there isn't. And so to believe that there is simply wishful thinking. And for Freud, that constituted an illusion and something that we should stop thinking in that way. So religion and religious belief for Freud was unhealthy psychologically. Next individual here, B.F. Skinner, also had a rather negative view of religion. Skinner's approach to psychology was known as radical behaviorism, a very materialistic, deterministic, and reductionistic approach to human behavior. And just like all human behavior, religious behavior is under the control of environmental variables, very deterministic in his understanding. And so with both Freud and Skinner, we have an approach to religion that was rather negative. And for many of the years in the middle part of the 20th century, if you were a psychologist, you simply would not study religion because it would not be a thing that you would study to advance your career. It would essentially be a dead end as far as trying to achieve tenure and promotion and those kinds of accomplishments that a lot of academics want. So religion was put aside as not something that you would study as a psychologist. Psychology wasn't interested in that. Well, in the latter part of the 20th century, that approach began to change. Part of the reason for it was that some research began to suggest, contrary to what Freud indicated, that religiosity was actually good for you. That is to say, research began to suggest that people who scored high on measures of religiosity lived longer. They had decreased mortality rates. They were less likely to experience certain kinds of diseases. Not only physical health, but mental health seemed to be improved in those individuals who scored high on these measures of religiosity. So in part because of that, surprising for many psychologists, those surprising findings, psychology began to, along with other disciplines, began to look more closely into this topic of religion, a topic that is very important to the vast majority of people in the world. And so if psychology is truly interested in human behavior and human thinking, it makes sense that psychology would be interested in studying this thing called religion that seems to be so important to why people act the way they do and why they think and believe the way that they do. So in the latter part of the 20th century, a variety of journals specializing in psychology of religion, books, graduate programs were developed. And not only psychology, but other sciences began to investigate religion and spirituality as well. So I want to take a little bit of a look at some of that work here in the next few minutes. Now here, of course, we have the very famous portion of Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel. This one, the creation of Adam. And here we see Adam about ready to receive something from God. God's about ready to touch Adam, giving him perhaps whatever it is that's going to make Adam human, perhaps giving Adam the image of God. Perhaps that's what Michelangelo is representing here. And this Sistine Chapel, these frescoes were painted back in the 16th century. And over the years, of course, they became grimy and dirty. And a few years ago, the frescoes were cleaned, very painstaking process, of course. And as they began to clean them, the colors became more apparent, and the vibrant colors that Michelangelo used, and some of the detail that had been missed for centuries began to emerge. And as we look at God here on the right, God is surrounded by the heavenly hosts. And look at a close-up here. We see sort of in God's left hand what art historians suggest is Eve about ready to go down to earth. Perhaps next to Eve, the baby Jesus, some historians suggest. So the heavenly host is in back of God here, the Father. But when some of the detail of the painting came out, some people began to wonder, well, what is this thing in back of the heavenly host? This sort of reddish, going back here, this reddish structure. And some suggested that perhaps Michelangelo, being well acquainted with anatomy, was trying to portray here the human brain. That perhaps what Michelangelo is suggesting here, that whatever it is God is doing here in providing Adam with whatever it is that's going to make him human, perhaps conveying the imago Dei, in some way involves the human brain. Well, whether or not Michelangelo was, had some sort of motive in that regard or not, I'm not sure. But nevertheless, it makes, I think, for a nice story and an introduction to what I want to talk about here, and that is neurotheology. Now, neurotheology is an unfortunate name, actually, and many of the people who work in neurotheology don't really like the term because they don't see themselves correctly as theologians. They don't see themselves as doing theology. But what neurotheology really is attempting to do is to investigate how the brain functions in terms of our relation to God. And I want to just point out here briefly some of the lobes of the brain that I'm going to be referring to in the next few minutes. Right at the very front, right in here, this is the frontal lobe. And so from the very frontal pole back to about here, that's considered the frontal lobe of the brain. From that point on back to about here is the parietal lobe, right in this large area here. Along the side, the temporal lobe, and then in the back, the occipital lobe. 4 principal structures of this most recently developed, most highly developed part of the brain. Well, one thing that we know from neuroscience is that as we have experiences, all of those experiences have to be translated to electrical impulses that enter the brain and go to the various parts of the brain for processing. So as I'm standing up here before you, and as you're looking at me, light's reflecting off of my body, entering your eyes, and that light energy is being transduced or changed into electrical impulses that travel to different parts of the brain, including that occipital lobe in the very back part of the brain that I mentioned a moment ago. As you're listening to me, the sound waves that I'm creating as I speak, those sound waves, that energy is entering your ears, and when that energy gets into the inner ear, into the cochlea, there are cells in there that transduce or change that kind of energy, sound energy, into electrical impulses. The same kinds of electrical impulses that are generated in the eyes. So as I'm speaking to you and as you are looking at me up here, I'm being represented in a very real sense in your brain through these neural impulses. And this is referred to as neural representation. And that's true for all of our experiences. Everything we experience has to be transduced or changed to these electrical impulses. But neuroscientists operate out of this assumption that these neural impulses generally, not always, but generally, they are a reflection of something that's actually in the environment. So hopefully, I'm not just in your minds or in your brains, I'm actually up here. I'm in reality itself. At least I would hope to think so. So just because something is being represented in our brains does not mean that that object isn't actually there. And in most cases, again, neuroscientists operate it out of this assumption of realism, as I have here on this screen. So the brain's reference, or the brain's perceptions, have reference in reality. It's reflecting something that's really there. And all of our experience is interpreted by the brain briefly in the way that I mentioned. So the assumption here is that this is true of religious experience as well. Just like all experiences have to be processed in some way through our brains, so too do religious experiences. So in that regard, we experience God through our brains. But again, that doesn't mean that God isn't really there. It's just that that's how we are experiencing God, just like we experience everything else that is, we believe, present in reality. One of the first individuals to do work in this area was Michael Persinger. And what I want to do is to just briefly mention some of these figures, some of these researchers. And I'm really going to begin with the ones that are very reductionistic in their interpretation of the data. Michael Persinger, who since the 1980s has been doing work in this area. Persinger is up at Laurentian University in Northern Ontario. And Persinger's position is that religious experience is really nothing but temporal lobe transience. Now, the temporal lobe is that lobe on the side of the brain that I pointed out a moment ago. And his argument is that when we have religious experiences, those religious experiences are nothing more than electrical impulses being generated in the temporal lobe. End of story for Persinger. So again, very reductionistic. Some of Persinger's later work, he has called religion a built-in pacifier, sort of similar to Freud's thinking. It's just wish fulfillment. We wish there was a God. We wish these religious stories were true, but they're not. But they pacify us. They make us feel good. Also, Persinger, sort of in the pattern of Richard Dawkins, who was mentioned earlier this morning, has also talked about God being a kind of a virus, a cognitive virus that's best to eliminate, like most viruses are better if we eliminate them. So again, a very reductionistic approach to religious experience. And just to finish up here with Persinger, and to give you a little bit of a flavor for his approach. Here we have what Persinger called the God helmet. And if you were a subject in one of Persinger's experiments, you would go to his lab, you'd put on this God helmet, he'd turn it on, and supposedly, by turning it on, he is, as we see here, stimulating the temporal lobes with electromagnetic waves. And people who put this God helmet on, Persinger reports that many of them had religious experiences. At least that's their account of what they experienced. Well, as you can imagine, this got a lot of attention in the popular press. It made for a kind of science versus religion story. Here's science sort of debunking religion. But while the popular press sort of made a lot of this work of Persinger's, it's interesting to note that the neuroscientists did not. And they didn't for a number of reasons. Number one, not everybody had experiences that they called religious when they put this helmet on. Secondly, you can imagine that if you're a student at Laurentian University, you've heard about this guy in the psychology department with the God helmet, and word gets out about what happens when you put this helmet on. So you go to his lab, put the helmet on, fully expecting that you're going to have this kind of religious experience. So the power of suggestion, perhaps, is part of the explanation of these findings, sort of a little bit of a confound. But third, and perhaps most troubling, at least from a neuroscientific perspective, is that while Persinger claims to be generating temporal lobe activity when people wear this helmet, he provided no evidence that he was in fact doing that. There are techniques now, and some of which we'll hear about tomorrow morning, that allow us to see what the brain is doing in real time. These are neuroimaging procedures or neuroimaging strategies. Persinger provided no neuroimaging data to support his claim that, in fact, people were having these temporal lobe transients or temporal lobe electrical activity when the helmet was worn. So the neuroscience community really didn't think a whole lot of Persinger's work, even though the popular press liked it quite a bit. Well, another reductionistic approach here is that of Ron Joseph. Joseph also looking at temporal lobe, primarily structures underneath the temporal lobe that make up what's called the limbic system. And Joseph's argument is that the reason why people across the world, across time, have had religious experiences is because all of us have a limbic system. And it functions in a similar way for all of us. And so these structures that make up the limbic system are the structures that are, as he put it, allowing us to connect to God, or this transmitter to God, as he put it. Now, Joseph acknowledged, I don't think he believes this personally, but acknowledged that perhaps we have these structures, and perhaps they function the way they do because there is a spiritual reality beyond us. So he at least acknowledged that possibility, although he does not personally hold that. He did not personally hold that himself. But both Joseph and Persinger are examples of a reductionistic view of these data. Religious experience is nothing but activity in temporal lobe or limbic system structures. Well, moving on to Nina Azari. Azari, using neuroimaging experiments and neuroimaging data, argues that broader areas of the brain are actually involved here, besides just temporal lobe or limbic system structures. Specifically, Azari is pointing out the involvement of brain areas that are involved in what is referred to as relational cognition. Relational cognition would refer to those kinds of cognitive thoughts, beliefs, attitudes, etc., that are involved in our relationships to other people. And there are pretty clearly identified neural mechanisms, at least they're being identified, that are involved in these kinds of relationships that we have with other people. And Azari is arguing that religious experience overlaps with those kinds of experiences as well. That the brain areas that are involved in these kinds of relational aspects to our existence are those that are also involved in religious experiences. Robert McNamara, also looking at broader areas of the brain besides temporal lobe, focuses primarily on the prefrontal cortex. Now, this is a part of the brain right at the frontal pole, right sort of in back of our eyes, the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is an area of the brain that is thought to be involved in mediating many of the capacities and functions that are considered to be involved in defining us as free human beings, like our ability to control our impulses, to make good judgments and decisions, to be able to think of the future or think in future terms. So these kinds of abilities seem to be mediated through prefrontal structures. These structures are also important in developing and maintaining our social relationships. So they're involved in defining who we are as individuals, as our identities as persons. Back in 1848, in Cavendish, Vermont, there was an accident that is very famous in psychology and neuroscience because of what resulted from damage to these prefrontal structures. Man's name was Phineas Gage, and Phineas Gage was a foreman on the railroad. And he and his crew were blasting rock in the mountains of Vermont in order to prepare the way to lay railroad track to that part of the state. And what was involved was drilling a hole in the rock, very obviously hard work, filling the hole with gunpowder, pouring sand on top of the gunpowder, and then tamping that sand down with a 3 or 4 foot iron rod, making a nice compact space for an explosion to occur. They would light the gunpowder, it would explode, they'd clear out the rock that was created, the debris, and start over again. So very grueling work. Well, Gage was in charge of a group of men who were doing this work. And no one knows exactly why, but the accident was that Gage perhaps forgot to put the sand on top of the gunpowder, but while he was using this tamping rod to prepare for the charge, perhaps the rod scraped the rock on its way down. There was an explosion, however it happened, and that tamping rod was driven through Gage's head, under his cheek and out the top of his head. Well, remarkably, Gage didn't even lose consciousness. His crew took him to the nearest town, Cavendish. The doctor there thought Gage was going to die in a few hours because of the massive damage, but in fact, Gage recovered, at least more or less, physically, he recovered. But Gage was different as far as his personality was concerned. His friends said that this is no longer Gage. This is not the man we knew. He couldn't control his impulses, whereas before he was very good at that. He could no longer hold down a job, couldn't lead men as he could before as a foreman. He became profane, something he never was before. His entire identity, in many respects, was changed. And it turns out that the path through that tamping rod took, through Gage's head, severed the prefrontal cortex from the rest of his brain. Again, illustrating the importance of those structures in many of our human-like characteristics that define us as human. So McNamara is focusing on that area of the brain and suggesting that religion tends to develop and foster and encourage the sort of maturation and development of those specific structures, enabling impulse control and good judgment and decision-making. At least that's the focus that McNamara is taking. Well, perhaps the best-known person in this work is Andrew Newberg at the University of Pennsylvania. In 2001, Newberg published this book, Why God Won't Go Away. And Newberg's argument is that the reason why God beliefs don't go away is because there's a biological basis for these beliefs. And there are neural mechanisms that encourage these kinds of beliefs. Now, Newberg, again, is looking, or using, I should say, neuroimaging techniques, unlike Persinger. So he's using many of these contemporary approaches to look at what the brain is doing when a particular act is performed, or when a person thinks something. What brain areas turn on, become active, what brain areas turn off, become unactive or inactive, when a person is having a particular thought, when they're reading something, when they're doing a multiplication problem, whatever the case may be, what does the brain look like when they're doing that? So in this case, Newberg is interested in imaging the brains of people while they report having religious experiences. And specifically, Newberg, in some of his more well-known work, is looking at the brains of Franciscan nuns and Buddhist monks. The monks while they're in meditation, and the Franciscan nuns while they are in prayer, contemplative prayer. And Newberg found changes in brain activity in prefrontal cortex and in the parietal lobe that I mentioned a moment ago. So widespread activity of the brain, including frontal cortex, prefrontal lobe in particular, and in the parietal lobe. Persinger argued that for both the nuns and the monks, that they are, when they're in contemplative prayer or in meditation, they are highly focused on their prayer or on their meditation. And that heightened awareness is made possible through this increased activity in the prefrontal cortex. So that part of the brain lit up, turned on, so to speak, when they were engaged in this experience. The parietal lobe is the area that Newberg found sort of decreased in activity, became silent. And for both the monks and the nuns, part of their religious experience that they reported was sort of a sense of oneness. A oneness with God for the nuns, perhaps a oneness with the universe for the monks. That might be how they express it. Nevertheless, this sort of this unity, this oneness, this loss of self that is often reported in meditative experiences. Well, Newberg argued that that loss of self, that sense of unity, is accomplished by this shutting down or turning off or turning down of the parietal lobe, or particular regions of the parietal lobe. In the parietal lobe, there is an area of the brain that is involved in helping us map out our body. So my entire body is mapped out on certain strip of tissue in the parietal lobe. Left side of my body in the right parietal lobe, right side in the left. So part of my sense of self, my sense of who I am, is that this is me, this physical structure is me, and this isn't. My body ends right here. So that sort of defining of the body is accomplished, Newberg argues, by these areas in the parietal lobe. And when they become silent, these areas, that sense of the body and where it ends and where it starts begins to become a little bit ambiguous. And so he suggests that that's part of the reason why the meditators, either in prayer or the Buddhist monks, that they are experiencing this loss of self, this sense of oneness with God, because they are losing this boundary, we might say, between their body and the rest of reality. Another individual here up at the University of Montreal is Mario Beauregard. Beauregard also works in a similar fashion to Newberg, neuroimaging, and again, he finds widespread brain activity in people who are reporting religious experiences. Widespread brain activity. So contrary to what we might see in some of the popular press, as they look at this literature and interpret it, there is no, quote, God spot. There is no place in the brain that turns on when we experience God or when we think about God. religious experience, as it's been studied in these kinds of experiments, seem to activate a wide variety of brain areas, which we probably should expect because religion is a complex phenomenon. And so we wouldn't expect to see one particular area light up or turn on when we have these kinds of religious experiences. And that's what's being suggested here by the work of Newberg, Beauregard, and many of the others. Well, some might look at this kind of research and say, there, it proves that the brain is producing God for us. That our brain wiring creates God. But one can look at the very same research and come to a different conclusion. And that is that if God created us for relationships with Him, would He not make us physically in such a way that we could, in fact, have those relationships and establish and form those relationships? And would not our brains be involved in that process, play a part in that process? So that's a little bit about this area called neurotheology. Again, an unfortunate term, but one that's sort of stuck and is with us. What role does the brain play in religious experience? And it seems to play a role. And it seems to suggest that the brain areas that are involved overlap those brain areas that are involved in our relationships those brain areas that are involved in establishing relationships, social connections with other people. Well, this next section, sort of in a slightly different vein, but some overlap nevertheless. This question of whether or not spirituality is something that's innate within us. And in this sort of literature, the working definition, I guess, of spirituality is that spirituality is an emergent property, an emergent property of the brain. That when the brain is highly complex, as it is in humans, new properties emerge out of that brain. As the brain is in action, as the brain is working, new properties emerge. And one of the properties that emerge would be what we would call spirituality. So here in this definition, spirituality is an embodied capacity which enables us to have personal relatedness with the self, with others, and with God. So there are certain brain mechanisms that are involved in helping us to recognize that we are separate selves from other people. So that's what's meant by this first statement here, a relationship with the self, that we are separate people, we are separate persons, separate identities. That this identity of mine, I can have a relationship with other people as well. So not only relationship with self, but relationship with others, and then third, relationship with God. And personal relatedness in this way, with the self, with others, and with God, requires certain cognitive abilities. And these cognitive abilities have neurobiological basis. We are beginning to be able to find out which brain areas are involved in these certain cognitive abilities. Well, this is similar to Aquinas' understanding of spirituality. Aquinas defines spirituality as the sum of all the unique, embodied human capacities and functions. Aquinas also argued that God calls all creatures to return to Him for the fulfillment of their being, a relationship with Him. And it's consistent with Augustine, who famously said of God, "You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." In this notion of relationship. Well, what is some of the evidence from neuroscience, psychology, and related fields that might suggest that there is something innate to us as human beings that we might call spirituality? Well, in 2003, the Commission on Children at Risk published their report. And the Commission on Children at Risk was called together to address this issue. Why is it that children today, in 2003 and today as well, why are children today having so many behavioral and mental health problems? Why are children taking guns into classrooms and shooting their classmates? Why are there so many children on anti-anxiety drugs, antidepressant medications? Why are children today seemingly having so many behavioral and mental health problems? The Commission on Children at Risk consisted of 33 physicians, research scientists, mental health specialists from a variety of fields. And in 2003, they made their report, and the summary is here. They argued that based upon the research that they discovered in their literature review, that we human beings are hardwired to connect, to form close connections to other people and deep connections to moral and spiritual meaning. Connect to something beyond ourselves, the transcendent. And the reason why children today are having behavioral problems and mental health problems is because children today aren't making these kinds of connections because their parents aren't. That as a society, over the last 50 years or so, we have become less community-oriented perhaps, and more individualistic in our lives. Robert Putnam in 2000, in his book Bowling Alone, describes how American society has become less community-oriented, more individualistic since the decade of the 1960s. Putnam notes a decline in political, civic, and religious involvement and interest in the last 50 years. Putnam also identifies a decrease in the formation of relationships in the workplace and in making informal social connections. Back in the 60s and before, bowling leagues, card clubs, very popular. Well, today, we bowl alone. That's the title of Putnam's book. We don't go to bowling lanes and bowl with other people. We might be in our living room and bowl on the TV. We're bowling by ourselves. Kiwanis, Lions, all of these social clubs, losing attendance. Churches losing attendance over the last 4 decades or so, by and large. So in a variety of ways, Putnam points out that as a society, we're just not making connections like we need to, and so our children aren't either. And our children are suffering, the Commission on Children at Risk suggests, as a result. So decline in relatedness. Well, I want to look at just some of the research points that the Commission on Children at Risk pulled out as they relate to our discussion here this afternoon. The brain organizes itself in the context of relationships with others, and there is a biochemistry, a biology to this connection process. The relationships that we have are not just nice, they're essential, the literature suggests, for the proper development and functioning of the brain. So the brain develops most completely and fully under the influence of these social relationships. And there's a biology to that process. For example, the hormone oxytocin that is released in the presence of other people with whom we have strong relationships. Second point here, the innate attachment process that a newborn has to a primary caregiver is the foundation for the emergence of conscience and morality. Biological systems prepare us to associate certain emotionally toned messages that some behaviors are good and therefore permitted, and that other behaviors are bad and not permitted, with reactions that the newborn gets from the attachment figure. Behaviors that please the attachment figure evoke positive emotions in the infant and are felt to be good, while behaviors that displease the attachment figure produce a negative emotional response in the infant and are felt to be bad. So in this way, again, the research suggests, attachments help guide a child's moral development. Children form their conceptions of God, in part, from their conceptions of their parents or other attachment figures. Early experiences with parents, for example, the happiness or disappointment that comes with relationships with parents, can facilitate or inhibit the development of a person's religious faith later in life. Studies of religiosity and spirituality suggest a positive benefit of these concepts to mental and physical health. One of the mechanisms through which spirituality and religiosity are thought to promote these health benefits is by way of social connectedness, or what's sometimes called social capital. Being in a relationship with others linked together by social ties and common values can have a salubrious effect on physiological mechanisms involved in health and illness. And then finally here, humans seem to have an innate drive to find meaning and order within reality. The human brain is organized to ask ultimate questions and seek ultimate answers. So that's just some of the findings of this Commission on Children at Risk as they looked at the medical, psychological, educational, neuroscientific evidence pointing to this need to make connections and that we are hardwired. We are made for these kinds of connections. And when we don't have them, we're going to suffer certain consequences. Connections with others as well as with something beyond ourselves, the transcendent. Other research, not associated with the Commission on Children at Risk, but research in social neuroscience in particular, are looking at these cognitive and neural mechanisms involved in, again, relating to other people, these social relationships. And in this regard, a finding from the 1990s, so relatively recent, on what are called mirror neurons. Mirror neurons were initially discovered in the motor cortex, that's the area of the brain that's responsible for initiating motor movements, motor cortex in monkeys. And these are neurons that fire, generate these electrical impulses, when the monkey is doing something like opening and closing its hand, or when the monkey sees someone else open and close his hand. So whether the monkey is doing something or whether the monkey sees that same behavior in someone else, these mirror neurons fire. Well, these mirror neurons are now known to be in humans. They're located throughout the human brain, and they're thought to be involved in various social behaviors and involved in our developing social relationships. They're thought, for example, to be involved in learning of language, in developing of empathy for someone else. Perhaps one of the reasons why we can understand what someone else is feeling, be empathic, is because the same neurons that would fire when we're sad fire when we see someone else sad. Or when we're happy, the same neurons fire when we see someone else happy. So we can get inside someone else's mind, we might say, through the functioning of these mirror neurons. So being able to understand what someone else is thinking, what someone else is feeling, what someone else might do, how they might act, these are all important in developing relationships with that person. And they are involved in what in psychology is referred to as theory of mind. And theory of mind is this understanding that we learn, that we develop by about the age of 4 or 5, that people think differently than we do, that people can have different attitudes than we do, that they can feel things differently than we do. So this being able to read someone else's thoughts, how they're feeling, what they might do, is referred to as theory of mind. Theory of mind is, in large measure, accomplished through structures in the prefrontal cortex. Again, getting back to this important area, and area that seems to be involved in defining us in large measure as far as some of our human characteristics and capabilities are concerned. The evidence from neuroscience on mirror neurons, theory of mind, social cognition suggests that specific regions of the brain, particularly in the prefrontal regions, are involved in social, relational, cognitive processes. When these brain areas are not functioning effectively, we will experience a deficit in our ability to fully relate to others, as Phineas Gage found. We might say that our spirituality is affected. Glenn Weaver interviewed caretakers of people with Alzheimer's disease. Of course, Alzheimer's disease is a horrible disease that results from damage to certain brain areas. So these nerve cells, these neural cells, neurons are dying off in massive numbers throughout the brain. So Glenn Weaver has been looking at the effects of Alzheimer's disease on social, relational, cognition, and spiritual life. So again, interviewing the partner caregivers of these patients with Alzheimer's disease, he found that the caregivers report certain changes in what we might consider the spiritual life of these patients. The observed changes include loss of a patient's spiritual life narrative, as memory is lost, a sense of spiritual emptiness, diminished participation in spiritual practices, personal prayer, corporate worship, difficulty experiencing God's comfort, and experienced guilt about the loss of close relationships in the community of faith. And while we wouldn't suggest that these people with Alzheimer's disease are no longer Christian, nevertheless, their spirituality seems to be affected by this horrible disease. Well, the above evidence that I've presented this afternoon suggests a biological foundation for spirituality, as it's considered here as relating to the self, others, and ultimately to God. The capacity to have a cognitive representation of the self, to have relatedness with others, and to have relatedness to God seems to involve these important brain areas. But I want to stress that this can be, and certainly I think should be, a non-reductive approach to what religious experience and spirituality, what they are. It's often said that reality is stratified, that there are different levels to reality. It's complex, requiring different perspectives, each perspective with its own method, each perspective with its own approach to studying that aspect or that level of reality. So can we study religious experience? Can we study spirituality biologically, psychologically, with neuroscience? I think, yes, that is an appropriate partial way to study religious experience and spirituality. That the methods of psychology and biology and neuroscience are just some of the methods that can be brought to bear in studying something as complex and multi-leveled as religion and spirituality. C.S. Lewis, in his short paper, Meditations in a Tool Shed, talks about being in a tool shed, and of course it's dark. But between the slats that make up the woodshed, light filters through. So there are rays of light that enter this dark tool shed. And he talks about a man being in this tool shed and looking at a ray of light. Looking at a ray of light. And looking at a ray of light, you come to that ray of light from a kind of a third-person perspective, Lewis suggests. You can see the dust particles floating in that ray of light. And so you can come to know something about that ray of light through that third-person looking at perspective. But Lewis suggests that you can also allow that same beam of light to strike your eye. And now you're looking along that beam of light, looking out the tool shed perhaps at sort of the trees that you can see outside. So same beam of light, same reality, but you're experiencing it through a first-person account, looking along that beam of light. So I like to think of that as perhaps a way of sort of bringing a psychological, cognitive, neuroscience approach to religion as a third person looking at that religious experience. But of course, we can also have a first person personal account of religious experience and spiritual experience as well. That is equally valid and perhaps more important to us as believers. So, just in summary here, perhaps through this kind of approach we can learn how religion is embodied within us. I mean, we do use our bodies in worship, and we are physical creatures, so it's important to think about the embodiment of religion. How religious behaviors affect us as individuals within a community and our relationships with those people. And finally, how this important, apparently universal human experience is expressed in us as individuals. So, thank you.
Thank you. Good. More for us to think about and talk about together. Thank you very much, Kevin, for that.